Governor Rauner delivers his State of the State address next week, and the primary races are heating up. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Campaign season is hot as we approach the March 20th primary. The governor is going to give his State of the State next week, and here to talk about these things with me, Rae Hodge is here. She is the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Daily Line. It's a subscription online newsletter. Welcome, Rae.
Thank you.
And Mark Maxwell, the Bureau Chief of WCIA, also known as Channel 3 to those people with the old kind of TV.
That's right.
Welcome back, Mark.
Thanks, Bernie.
Governor's going to give his State of the State next week. Okay, what's the State of the State? And I guess we could start talking about budget as we find out the comptroller put out a debt transparency report last week saying that the state agencies have something like $2.3 billion waiting to be even delivered to the comptroller's office for payment. And we've now crossed the line where the state has come to owe or pay more than $1 billion in late payments.
Well, I think it'll probably be a bone of contention in the midst of those debt transparency report payments is what we've got is $1 billion now that essentially accrued as a self-imposed late fine. It started out, these late fees were started out as an incentive to make the state pay its bills on time, and then it sort of unraveled from there, stacked up from there. In the process of the budget impasse, it mounted up. So you've got some Republican pushback already coming from that among legislators who are wanting to see us remove those kind of penalties or find a way to shore up so that we don't get that. Who knows if that's going to be addressed, but it does seem like an easy entryway if you're going to talk about, a backlog of debt. It seems like a good place to start that conversation if you are, a governor trying to met that out.
Yeah. Nobody likes paying $1 billion in late fees. Yeah. I don't like paying a $34 overdraft fee. So the fees are not good. And Comptroller Mendoza shows a bit of political cunning in laying this tripwire just ahead of the budget proposal, but also the State of the State address, which you mentioned. Yeah. Governor Rauner probably has a fork in the road. We know that his campaign staff is sitting down and saying, how can we make this State of the State address a big moment for him? That's going to be tricky. I think his two options are to say, we've gone to war, using his rhetoric with the Mike Madigan political machine, and we've lost.
And the Democrats who control the legislature and still control the legislature.
But looking back through history at other fighters who have lost some, they've also stuck around long enough to win some. Where are the reinforcements? Let's ready the troops. That gets a little too close to campaign rhetoric, so it's probably more likely that we'll see the governor say something about, putting lipstick on a pig, that it's really not that bad and we won a few, and he'll probably stick more in that lane. But who knows? It could be a very interesting. Some have started asking, will this be Governor Rauner's final State of the State address? He certainly hopes it's not, but this is an election year, and so it's impossible to overlook all of the extra pressure that's on not just the governor, but every other sitting legislator that will be in that hall when he delivers his speech January 31st.
Right, and of course, the budget address is now scheduled for Valentine's Day, February 14th. That's where the nuts and bolts of a budget are supposed to be said. Outside groups that have looked at Governor Rauner's three past budget addresses have said he didn't really introduce balanced budgets. He always says they are. Last year, for example, he included one line of revenue that said $4.5 billion from the grand bargain that the Senate is working on. That $4.5 billion never materialized. The Democrats will say that the governor pulled off Republican votes, so it never went anywhere in the Senate. The governor hasn't exactly said that. He does say, though, that after some Republicans joined Democrats and finally passed a budget after a 2-year impasse and passed a tax increase, which brought it from 3.75% on individuals to 4.95%, that he wants to roll it back in steps over years to 3%. Given the bills, there's still like more than $8 billion in back payments after the state borrowed, I think it was $6 billion. You've got these couple of $1 billion stuck in state agencies, not even yet to the comptroller's office, and we're getting more revenue. I think it's about $5 billion a year from the tax increase. Can the governor realistically say we're going to roll this back and make government work? How hard is that?
I think the first thing that is going to have to be a part of that conversation is obviously it's not just about rolling back the tax, right? It's not just about cuts and pulling back. It's also about revenue generation. So part of this conversation, in order for it to really sail, in order for it to have enough vigor to really come across well, you're going to have to start talking about revenue streams. And, those are going to be coming and going as, different proposals come out. But regardless, you're going to have to address revenue issues. That's you're not going to escape having to address that in a budget.
And the governor always says for the last 4 years, including the campaign time, plus his years as governor, we need to reform Illinois, we need to make it easier to do business, we need to lower workers' compensation costs. He often talks about the strain, particularly on local governments, but also the state of pensions. Long-term, you can't change what's already there because of our Constitution. Prevailing wage on projects. He wants to erode some of that union strength. Again, he's trying to do that with a Democratic legislature, so I'm guessing we might hear some of that again, while he's also trying to sell the state, tell Amazon to come to Chicago for their second headquarters, and try to crow about some of the businesses that have come to Illinois.
Well, you're picking at some of the core ideologies of the Republican growth philosophy. It's interesting, though, that's the big pledge that J.B. Pritzker has made in his campaign as well, that yes, a budget is how much you take in tax, how much you spend, but growth as well. And that's this whole concept of bringing new jobs, expanding revenues, expanding paychecks for people. And Governor Rauner has tried to focus on the granular details of that, and he goes about it differently, how he would approach growth than maybe a J.B. Pritzker or another Democrat would. But the whole concept, the big elephant in the room, is that Illinois is losing people left and right. These are taxpayers. And when you look at the Department of Revenue data, it shows that each year we lose taxpayers. Each year we lose working people, and that erodes the tax base itself. So even if the old Quinn tax numbers were still there, Illinois would be declining in terms of revenue that it's bringing in, simply because people are getting up and leaving the state of Illinois.
Right. Well, and it is true that Governor Rauner is not for changing our income tax system to a progressive tax where people with more money pay more, like the federal system and like most states have. But all of the major Democrats, there's a guy named Robert Marshall who wants to split the state into 3 states.
Who's
not considering a
Democrats?
major Democrat.
Yeah.
But the major Democrats running for governor want a progressive income tax. There could be some just changes in deductions and credits early on to get that done while there's still a flat tax to make the rich pay more. But over time it would take a constitutional amendment because our state constitution from 1970 calls for a flat income tax. But Pritzker and Kennedy and Biss and Diber all want a progressive income tax, but that would take constitutional amendment, which couldn't possibly be on the books, and it would have to pass the state, and it would have to overcome opposition from people like Bruce Rauner and his party. So it's a difficult road, but it shows a definite difference in, they say regular folks will pay less and just the rich will pay more, but the Rauners of the world say job creators won't come to Illinois if you want them to pay more. Again, it's just a philosophical difference.
Sure, and then on top of that, you'll have the trickle-down effect of, and pardon the pun, but you'll have an effect where your other tax systems immediately come into question, your property tax systems and things like of that nature that have been used as a compensatory, a mechanism.
Yeah.
It was interesting to hear every single one of the Democrats on the primary debate stage on Tuesday night mention that the property tax burden in Illinois is too heavy. And it's hard to say anything otherwise when you're jockeying with New Jersey for the highest property tax burden in the country. So some Democrats are pitching the progressive tax, shifting the burden to the wealthiest in the state as a trade-off for a property tax break, but it's difficult to see how that looks in legislative form because they're not exactly apples to apples.
Well, we have to see where it goes. I mean, I look back to 1994 and Dawn Clark Nutch was a Democratic candidate against Jim Edgar seeking a second term, a Republican governor. She said we need lower property taxes and higher income taxes to pay for schools. She was trashed by Governor Edgar in advertisements saying she wanted this big tax increase. He won, I think it was 101 counties of 102. This may be a different time. We'll see how people sell it. The Democrats are going to have a lot of money. We don't know who the candidate's going to be. Pritzker's obviously a billionaire. Rauner is close to that. We're going to have perhaps the most expensive spending out there. But one of the problems, the reason property taxes are high is because our Constitution says that the state should be the predominant funder of education, K through 12, when in fact the state is only spending about 25%, and so property taxes have an overarching burden in meeting those costs, which is why property taxes are high, which is also why you have better schools in rich areas, because they have more rich properties. So it's a problem that's been tried to be worked out for years. We still have a school funding formula that was changed this year. There was some legislation. We'll see if the legislature overrides or does something with Governor Rauner's veto of a bill which got more schools into more non-public schools into a system where they could get
tax credits and scholarships.
The scholarship program, because that has held up putting the new school aid funding formula into it. But none of this stuff is easy.
No, absolutely not.
So we'll see. Mark, you mentioned the debate Tuesday in Chicago. It was on NBC5 in Chicago and carried around the state on some radio stations after that. And you had the Democratic candidates for governor. There was an interesting point in that where the top two candidates were asked by Carol Maureen, who was the moderator of the debate, Pritzker, can you say something nice about Chris Kennedy? And he said, well, the Kennedy family has done nice things for Special Olympics. And then she said, Mr. Chris Kennedy, can you say anything nice about J.B. Pritzker? And he said, no, as running against somebody who's really the poster child for corruption with property taxes and everything, I can't really figure out anything nice to say. He kind of apologized later. Was this a bad moment for Kennedy?
It's usually seen as a break from political decorum when you don't have that human moment and say, any one of the number of things that most people can recognize about Mr. Pritzker, for instance, that he founded and funded the Holocaust Museum. And
the one in Skokie.
Correct. And he did, and he did a lot of work with early childhood education, even closely with the Obama and I think the Clinton, not the administration, but with the Clinton Foundation, and helped to pave the way there. And there's a lot of easy things that you could have said there. I think what Kennedy was trying to do was trying to harness or tap into that anti-establishment rage that everyone saw in 2016. Because make no mistake, every political advisor out there that watched 2016 is trying to learn from it and mine from it lessons for how they can change or tweak their message going forward. And I think he felt this was a chance to align himself with the outsiders, the people who feel that they're not a part of the inside conversation.
Do you think there was that much thought in it, or was it just that he doesn't like Pritzker?
I do think from conversations with their campaign and with their advisors, and I think there is a gut instinct of Kennedy to go in that direction, to try and rage against this machine. But there's also the truth that Chris Kennedy at one point thought he was the insider candidate. He courted Mike Madigan's support for more than a decade, for really almost 2 decades now. He attended the Democratic National Convention just in 2016 and was basically peddled and introduced as the heir apparent. I mean, he was going to be the next.
He was finally going to take the plunge and stay in the
This
campaign.
was his big, and then he sort of got pushed aside and feels scorned, and so now he's only raging against the Madigans and the Berrioses and the property tax system. And so it looks like sort of a fight picked out of convenience or out of scorn or revenge to some insiders in the Democratic Party. But they're sitting back to watch and see how this plays out. I think most people, Bernie, saw that was a moment where he got overheated and caught up, swept away in his own campaign messaging. Some Democrats have compared that to Governor Rauner's behavior as well, where he just couldn't let a personal difference set aside long enough to throw a word of favor toward his opponent.
Yeah, interesting. And Ray, I'll ask you about Daniel Biss is kind of considered the other major candidate. Don't tell the Bob Dibers of the world, who is the Madison County Superintendent of Schools. But Daniel Biss is a state senator from Evanston. He's running as the middle class candidate. Me and my wife, we just make ends meet, and we're trying to send our kids to college. He of course, a smart guy. He was a professor of math at the University of Chicago when he was 25. He put out an ad, at least digitally, and it might be running beyond computers, comparing Kennedy and Pritzker to Donald Trump and Bruce Rauner as taking care of the property tax system, as not giving us their full tax returns, even though Kennedy and Pritzker put out top pages, just like Governor Rauner generally does. So is Daniel Biss, who also caught some heat from Pritzker in that debate, catching any traction here?
Yeah, it's an interesting tack to take, isn't it? When you listen to Daniel Biss on the floor when he is talking in terms of legislation, when he's talking in terms of policy. You hear a lot of nuanced arguments from him. You hear somebody who has thoroughly studied whatever he's got his hands on. So to sort of, as Mark was saying, kind of go into a vein of populism, sort of in an attempt to, create this distance. I don't know if it will play as natural with the people who are familiar with him, but I do know that it could be a very effective tack to take. It definitely surprised me. It caught me off guard. I didn't really expect to see that sort of tone out of an advertisement. But he's still in this. He's still picking up endorsements. He's still got a team that's running.
He got MoveOn.org, which of course is a very liberal organization, but they came out for Biss this week.
It's really about the people who are in this in terms of who are going to show up and vote, right?
Yeah, well, and it also depends. I mean, this could be a big voting year because the whole reaction to Donald Trump's presidency in the 2016 race. So it's hard to say what's going to happen because all of us in the media who have tried to predict these things have been shown to be often not right.
Well, we
on
can
predictions.
We can learn from history in terms of what primaries look like in a crowded Democratic field, and a person who has all the endorsements of the establishment in a state where establishment and really moderate centrist Democrats win a lot. That is going to be really hard to.
And you're talking about a lot of unions for Pritzker, that kind of
unions,
thing.
both U.S. senators in Duckworth and Durbin, popular Congresswoman Sherry Bustos, who's seen as sort of a rising star of the Democratic Party, State Senator Andy Menard downstate, native of Springfield. When you have all of these people aligning, Comptroller Susana Mendoza, who's increasingly popular in the Democratic Party, especially. When every single one of those big names is pushing one candidate, and all the labor unions are actively pushing one candidate, in a primary race, especially in a crowded field, when it's not just a two-man race, that is going to be very hard to overcome.
Well, and Hillary Clinton did win double-digit win in Illinois last year, so
not in the primary though.
Well, that's true.
It was closer in the primary.
That's true. You're correct. You're correct. But we weren't a Trumpian state, but we were. And the Democratic Party, there is a good progressive movement, but you're right, there is a lot of traditional stuff.
She did win the primary, but not by double digits. It was a lot
closer than that.
That is
correct. Thank you for correcting me on that. Back to the governor. He had tried to seal through his lawyers, or his lawyers tried to seal a lawsuit against him about a pre-governor business deal that he did. It involved somebody named Kip Kirkpatrick.
That's fun
they
to say.
had a company that was active in Michigan. Governor Rauner put $5 million into this venture. Apparently, he was supposed to get out of a settlement of movement around these companies $67 million. The governor was supposed to get $20 million.
Sure.
And according to a lawsuit filed by Mr. Kirkpatrick and just opened by a judge, unsealed by a judge in Cook County in the last several days, the governor talked to Mr. Kirkpatrick about this, including one time at the executive mansion. The governor's people basically say they're mischaracterizing the conversations, but the Associated Press found that there was a meeting on that day that was alleged with Mr. Kirkpatrick in the executive mansion. And the governor apparently wasn't satisfied with getting $20 million from his $5 million investment, and so wanted it to go to arbitration, and so there's a lawsuit ensuing. It's not illegal, apparently, for the governor to talk business in the executive mansion, which is not only state property but his home.
It is a residence, right.
But the governor also said early on, I will put all of my assets in a blind trust. When he was asked about this lawsuit before it came open, he said, I don't really know anything about this. I don't even know if lawyers are dealing with it. I suppose they are. It turned out not to be really a blind trust that he established, but a power of attorney to a financier in New York who's supposed to be handling these things. But if the governor says he has nothing to do with his finances and then was talking about it, and the lawsuit alleged in Springfield at the mansion and another time in Chicago, that just makes it look like he hasn't exactly been square with us.
I think you correctly put this into two bins. There's the lawsuit, which it's very hard to conceive a way in which the governor would use his power to shape or craft the outcome of this case. It's an investment settlement, a contract deal that two sides disagree about the outcome. That's fairly routine in these deals, and they're taking it out in court. The governor also does have a legal right to have private conversations with other business owners about pre-existing or even current deals, although that would be an ethical breach for if there was a current deal he was negotiating that had state business. But again, it's hard to see how this one-off deal has anything to do with his job as governor. Now, that said, you're correct to say that it runs counter to his public statements, and it really raises the question of why even be untruthful about this specific incident, because the governor was advised by his team on specific parts of the floor and the layout in the executive mansion and in the director's house at the state fairgrounds where you can have private meetings, where you probably shouldn't, ethically. So he was clear. He had in written form exactly what he could do, what the rules were. So to go to the public and say, I don't know anything about that case, well, that becomes very difficult to believe.
And we will see where that one goes. Speaking of ethics at the State House, there was a situation that caused a lot of interest, I guess. Ira Silverstein is a state senator from Chicago. His wife is an alderman in Chicago. There was a person seeking legislation to protect victims of abuse. Her name is Denise Rothheimer, who alleged at a hearing when this whole Harvey Weinstein thing happened and sexual harassment thing happened, claiming that Ira Silverstein had been inappropriate in handling legislation for her, which never passed, but that there were text messages at midnight, et cetera, et cetera. Well, anyway, the legislature finally, after 3 years without one, named an inspector general, Julie Porter. She put out a report this week saying that Silverstein had acted unbecoming of a legislator by getting a little personal with some of his messages, over 400 pages worth that were printed out, but that it was not sexual harassment and he should just be counseled by an ethics officer. Thoughts on that?
Can you imagine a less enviable position to be in than that of Legislative Inspector General in an office that has been vacant for many years with very limited statutory authority, appointed by people who you now have to investigate and tasked with a backlog, and then handed someone who is by all lights sort of expected to be made an example of? The pressure on Inspector Porter must have been unbearable. I know I don't envy her position.
Well, I haven't met her, but I assume that she got this job because, a lawyer who knows how to handle these things in a bloodless way.
What this really, I think, shows us is not necessarily whether there is a guilt or an innocence here. Obviously, she has said that there's a clear violation of the Legislative Ethics Act. Whether she determines it's harassment or anything else, it's a violation is a violation. You violated the act. There should follow after something. What we're seeing, however, is that there's no penalty for any violation of the Ethics Act. And what we're also seeing is that with Rothheimer, there was feedback on the decision that she was not given a due process. So what that tells us about this whole situation is that it's very unclear what this process should be. It's very unclear what those bringing forward these accusations should expect in terms of justice. I mean, if you're expecting a due process, that tells us quite a bit about what's been communicated about the powers, capacities, and expectations of the office.
I would also say this is not a this is not a Harvey Weinstein or Matt Lauer case. It made clear in the more than 25-page report there was no actual contact, sexual contact. There was just some innuendo in messages, and so there was some inappropriate stuff. And Denise Rothheimer, who kept wanting her legislation to pass, the stuff she was interested in, did make flirtatious tweets and texts back, and so there was a give and take. I'm just saying.
Right.
That's why.
The report found that there was not enough outward or communicative pushback from Ms. Rothheimer to warrant any kind of to trigger a signal for Senator Silverstein that he should not pursue or not engage, and that it found that she tried to. The report found that she tried to pick this conversation back up at a few different moments, but I do think she's also trying to do something interesting, which is spark a public conversation about what this process looks like. What methods, how is she heard or how is any woman heard when she brings forward a complaint? And two, a person of power, specifically a man in power, how do they comport themselves when they know that their vote or that their position gives them a lot more leverage over people in lesser circumstances. So there are some still cultural and societal conversations to occur.
Absolutely.
The legislative process appears to be, or the review process appears to be over, but Ms. Rothheimer's intent on having this conversation proceed into, hey, while I'm here under this review spotlight, are we doing this right?
Yeah, well, interesting. I think we're going to see more. She was going to run for state rep, but didn't have adequate signatures, so isn't. Ira Silverstein, as we tape the show, may not have enough signatures to get back on the ballot, but wants to run again. But there are primary opponents against him with some strong people on their side. So there will be continuing political ramifications here. I talk about impact on people when I open the show all the time. There's something that State Representative Carol Sente of Vernon Hills introduced this week in Chicago, the Dave Duerson Act, she's calling it. It would say that there cannot be in Illinois organized tackle football if your kid is for kids under 12. We would be the first state to do it. Dave Duerson was on the Super Bowl Bears, ended up killing himself because he had the CTE, apparently, problems from playing football when he was 50. His son was at the press conference. Otis Wilson of the Bears was there. Mike Adamle, who was a sportscaster in Chicago and a football player who is having problems, was there. But it's also true, Carol Sente, the legislature has already announced she's not going for another term. Legislation like this, if it's on the cutting edge, I think often takes a long time, so it might be difficult for this to pass this year. What do you think?
Right, you've really got to work pretty hard to bring both parties together on that. And if this is if you're already bowing out, then there's no telling who's going to be able to pick that ball up and run with it. Forgive the pun, but it is a kind of an important conversation to have because it's already happening on the national leagues. It's already happening on the college leagues, and what we're now realizing is that traumatic brain injury, more often than not, ends up being comorbid with other disorders that are cognitively dangerous as a person ages, and to expose kids to what could be ostensibly very, very dangerous stuff that we're learning more about. I'm certain there's always going to be a legislative response. Now, whether or not, as you said, that gets untangled and gets across
this quickly, that's going to be tough to do. And we will see the youth leagues are already saying there's no evidence yet, and we've changed the rules already. We'll see where it goes. We're going to have to leave it there. Rae Hodge, thanks very much. Mark Maxwell, thank you. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.